Hi guys, and welcome back to the Talks with Deems podcast. I know that I've been slacking. I don't want to hear it, guys. I know I've been slacking, but I'm back now. I've been seeing everyone's messages asking me like, whatever happened to your podcast? And everyone who ever sees me just keeps telling me like, whatever happened to your podcast? But honestly, I just haven't found the time. I know that's not quite a valid excuse, but I don't really have any other excuse other than that. But the year's about to end. I can't let this year end with only one episode out, so we're back at it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a series of episodes that are basically called Can We Blame It All on Colonialism? Each episode asks whether colonialism was a root cause or just a contributing cause or just, a bit of an influence in any of the conflicts, and we're going to be looking at different states, like different countries within Africa. Now, I know a lot of people are always saying like enough was colonialism, enough was speaking about colonialism and the colonizers, and there's so many reasons why people say this, but the two reasons that I've heard the most were, one, Africans sold themselves out to begin with, and which I genuinely get that a lot, and the second one is it was such a long time ago. Colonialism was such a long time ago. But was it really a long time ago if countries are still experiencing the impacts of colonialism? It was not that long of a time ago. So the country that I'm going to start with today is Rwanda, and more specifically, I'm going to talk about the Rwandan genocide of 1994. The Rwandan genocide of 1994 was the worst genocide of the 20th century. It was a 100-day period of killing and straight horror, and so many human rights agencies claim that nearly 500,000 people were killed. A lot of other sources say that it was 800,000 people were killed, but it doesn't matter. It's a lot of people. Some victims' bodies were never found, ever, and decades after the genocide, people are still finding mass graves. Now, what's different about this genocide isn't that it's an African genocide. Like, yes, that makes it a different thing, that it's an African genocide, but that isn't the big thing. The big thing is the world only had one huge genocide to compare it to, and that was the Holocaust. The Holocaust was organized. It was done in a specific way. It was done in a way, when I say organized, I mean it was done by a militia, the Nazis, and they would take the Jews to concentration camps, and they would kill them using specific methods. By doing this, they set the standard of what a genocide should look like. Now, in comparison to Rwanda was nothing like that. It wasn't even similar, not even slightly. It was ordinary people that were responsible for killing. I'm talking neighbors are killing their neighbors, husbands are killing their wives, and priests are killing the people who came to hear them preach. And on top of that, as the genocide was ongoing, no one wanted to claim that it was a genocide. The whole world turned a blind eye to Rwanda and said, no, it's a civil war. They're going through something civil. And this was because of so many reasons. One, calling a genocide would mean that they would have to get involved. That by international law, states are basically obligated to intervene. But if it's seen as a civil war, then never mind, the state has right to sovereignty and we shouldn't get involved. And basically what they don't want to do is they don't want to get involved. They don't really care enough to get involved. And the second reason is they're comparing it to the Holocaust. So, and the thing is, with genocides, if you start calling conflicts a genocide so easily and labeling it a genocide, then people are genuinely going to get desensitized. And you know what? People are already desensitized, if I'm being very honest, and that's a terrible thing. So, this genocide was going on, and nobody cared. Nobody cared what was going on in Rwanda. But anyway, let's talk about the period before the genocide. How did this genocide even start? Because, I'm realizing that a lot of people are starting to think like if a conflict happens, it's happened because there was one trigger. There's never, ever one trigger in any conflict in history. Never. If anything, when you're looking at a conflict, don't start looking at what happened a year ago to understand the conflict. Start looking time back, because that's the only way that you're truly going to understand the situation. So within Rwanda, there were 3 tribes. There was the Tutsi, there was the Hutu, and there was the Twa, if I'm saying this right. So the Belgians are the ones that colonized Rwanda. But we're not even going to talk about that. For now, we're going to just talk about the Hutu and the Tutsi tribe. They were social categories. So basically like rich and poor, and like you could climb your way to the top. And the Tutsis were basically seen as the top. But basically what I'm saying is these groups would change. Like they were not fixed whatsoever. They were not fixed categories. And the Tutsis and the Hutus, they shared the same language, they shared the same culture, shared the same traditions, shared the same everything. They were the same. So when the Belgians came in, basically, they looked at what was going on in Rwanda and they saw these non-fixed social categories and they said basically that we don't want that anymore. And they decided to racialize the tribes. So they said the Tutsis, they claimed that the Tutsis looked more European. And, they were like taller and they were like slightly, 1% lighter, and they're like, okay, you know what, you guys are clearly the superior race and we're going to make you guys a different race, when they were the same. So the Belgian colonial rule brought in racial anthropology that basically falsely claimed that, the Tutsi tribe were the superior tribe, the superior race, whereas the Hutus were inferior. They somehow managed to change a non-fixed social category and make it a rigid racial hierarchy. They racialized the tribes to try and make them seem as if they were different. They were not different. And what they did they gave them identity cards, ethnic identity cards. So it was fixed. You were seen as Hutu, khalas, like you're Hutu. You're not going to change no matter what. You're Tutsi, it doesn't matter how much. It doesn't matter if your status goes all the way to the top. I'm not even going to let you get to the top to become Tutsi. So now, these were permanent. What you had at first, your tribe, wherever it may be, is permanent now. And by doing this, they created a system where ethnicity meant power or no power. So if you were Tutsis, they started favoring the Tutsis. If you were Tutsi, they would actually give you, access to education, access to the government, access to basically anything you wanted. Whereas if you're Hutu, I'm not gonna help you. You don't get anything. So obviously, this created deep resentment among the Hutus. And not just did they direct it to the Belgians, they directed it to the Tutsis. So as the fight for independence was ongoing in other parts of Africa, Rwanda had its own fight against Belgian colonization. And with this came the rise of Hutu nationalism, and then there was a Hutu revolution. There was a huge rise of Hutu power. After they won the Hutu revolution. And because they won the Hutu revolution, thousands and thousands of Tutsis fled to bordering countries. So fast forward to post-independence, Hutu dominated government in Rwanda. Keep in mind that now that there's independence and the Belgians are gone, the Hutus that had so much resentment and directed it both to the Tutsis and the Belgians, now the Belgians are gone. Where are they going to direct their resentment? They're obviously going to direct it to the Tutsis, and the Tutsis knew that. They knew that the Hutus felt a lot of resentment towards them. So something important to acknowledge is that Rwanda's economy highly relied on, coffee exports. So coffee in the 20th century was like the biggest, like the single most important export for Rwanda. The global coffee market collapsed. So by it collapsing, the economy obviously went down. And what does that mean? That means that poverty leads to chaos. By poverty leads to chaos, I mean, for example, more poverty meant an increase and an easier way of people actually being recruited into like militias. There was government instability because of the economy. The frustration that came with the terrible economy was turned into a way to scapegoat the Tutsis by the Hutu extremists and get the blame away from the Hutu-led government. Now, the Tutsis that fled to different countries, especially like neighboring countries, they would get a lot of discrimination talking about go back to your country. Now, the Tutsis that fled to bordering neighboring countries, all they wanted to do was go back home to Rwanda. But, they couldn't because Hutus were now in power and they knew that there was a lot of resentment towards them. So the Tutsis, especially the ones in Uganda, created a Rwandan Patriotic Front. The Rwandan Patriotic Front was basically a political movement with an armed wing as well. And what they wanted was they wanted shared power with the Hutus in government. They wanted the refugees to go back to Rwanda, basically. And, they wanted just an end of racial discrimination between the two, allegedly. Now, what happened? In 1990, the armed wing of the Rwandan Patriotic Front went into Rwanda, and the Hutus saw this as an invasion, and it started like a civil war within Rwanda. Now, this invasion strengthened Hutu extremists, they saw this as proof that the Tutsis are up to no good, and basically helped, set the pace for the genocide that was to happen in 1994. Now, after the Hutu revolution, the new president of Rwanda, his name is Habyarimana. Habyarimana is he is Hutu. That's something that's really important to acknowledge. Now, after the Rwandan Patriotic Front entered Rwanda, they basically made a deal with Habyarimana, and these are the Arusha Accords. And in the Arusha Accords, they basically agreed to, share power with the Tutsis. So Hutus and Tutsis both in power in the government. The Arusha Accords also stated other things such as the return of the exiled Tutsis, democratic reforms for both the tribes, and the integration of the RPF into the national army. And to my Sudanese listening to this right now, I know this sounds really familiar to what's happening in Sudan, but like usual, one thing about history is that it loves to repeat itself. The thing is, even this agreement was highly controversial because the president and his inner circle, basically, they kept delaying it. They kept delaying the implementation of this, power sharing agreement. So they were clearly trying to sabotage it. But like I said, it is highly controversial. But the thing about this is, controversial or not, true or not, sabotage or not, the Hutu extremists were not happy about this. They was obviously really pissed off about it. Now, one of the biggest triggers of the genocide was that Habyarimana's plane was shot down, to make matters completely worse. So it is highly controversial of who actually shot down his plane. A lot of people say it's Hutu extremists because they was really pissed off that, he agreed to the Arusha Accords. He agreed to a power sharing agreement with the Tutsis. And a lot of people are saying, no, it's actually the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the Tutsis, because they want to take power. They're seeing this as a coup, basically. Either way, regardless of who did it, whoever shot down Habyarimana's plane, this was one of the biggest triggers for the genocide because it basically invited all the Hutus to pick up their machetes and use violence instead. So within hours of Habyarimana's plane being shot down, the roadblocks were already set up. Not just that, but the targeted killings of Tutsis and Hutu moderate leaders had already started. So that basically led to a 100-day period of killing. Now, as this was going on, there was a rise of the RTLM. The RTLM is a radio station, which I find stupidly interesting because it's crazy how much power a simple radio station held. It was the most influential hate station. At first, it was just like a radio station that people would play like in the background. They wouldn't really be tuning into it, They would just be cracking jokes and, playing music and just the regular stuff for the radio station. But as more tension rose in the country, the radio station started getting more aggressive, started saying some mad stuff, and people started actually tuning into this. They used jokes and music to, lure in like the listeners, but they started like wrapping it up with like hate messages to make it seem like it's normal and acceptable. But then at some point they just flipped completely. They started referring to Tutsis as cockroaches. And this, this method of dehumanization makes it, I guess, psychologically easier for the genocide to happen. Because if anything, when you start viewing humans as like pests, you don't really see it as murder anymore. You start seeing it as taking out the threat. And on top of that, the radio station, they started spreading fear. They started spreading fear and paranoia. They started telling everyone, the Tutsis are coming to get you. The Tutsis are going to kill you. The Tutsis are planning an attack. They're planning to take over the country. And these false claims obviously had the Hutus thinking, we need to act first. We need to wipe them out before they wipe us out, even though the Hutus were the majority. And then during the genocide, during the peak of the genocide, the radio station was no longer telling people, oh, Tutsis are cockroaches or Tutsis are this or that. They started giving clear instructions to kill. They started listing out home addresses. They started listing out names. They started telling people where the Tutsis were hiding. If the Tutsis were hiding in the church, you listen to the radio station to find out. That's crazy. That's genuinely crazy. Oh, and by the way, this is presented in the movie Hotel Rwanda. If you guys haven't watched it, genuinely, you need to watch it. Because it shows you how the UN completely disregarded the Rwandan people and took out the Europeans and left the Rwandans to die. And on top of that, it shows you how much power the radio station had. So after the genocide, they made the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And basically, it was a UN-led court to basically get justice for the Rwandan genocide. They made it in 1995, a year after the genocide. Because after the Rwandan genocide, the Rwandan justice system was understaffed and, the people who were working in the justice system, like, what could they possibly do? There were too many people to prosecute. You cannot prosecute the whole of Rwanda or the majority of Rwanda. But the tribunal basically convicted a lot of, major players in the genocide. For example, John Paul, who was the mayor. And on top of that, what the tribunal actually did was set in international law that rape is actually a form of genocide. It is a method that is used. Because before that, there was nothing like that. Before the Rwandan genocide, no one saw rape as, or just sexual violence as violence in a way of genocide. On top of that, they held the media accountable for spreading propaganda to incite genocide. But even after all of that, what does that really do? Because in the end of the day, this is something that's led by the UN. The UN had their chance to do something during the genocide and they chose not to. Instead, they ran away. What is the point of going out of your way to make a court, to make a tribunal, to basically serve justice if you're not even going to serve 100% of the justice? The tribunal was closed in, I think, 2015. Don't quote me, guys. But regardless of that, justice is never going to be served again. Justice was never fully served either, because like I said, you can't really prosecute majority of Rwanda because it wasn't just major people. It wasn't a big militia or just the government. It was ordinary people as well. Another thing that I don't see as a trigger but definitely played a role was the international community completely ignoring what's happening and labeling it as a civil war. The UN got clear warnings such as stockpiling of weapons and even a list of Tutsi targets, but still denied any requests for reinforcements. But again, scholars argued that the killings were so fast-paced that it made it nearly impossible for intervention to even succeed. Either way, them ignoring it allowed the Hutus to execute the genocide 10 times easier. So the Rwandan genocide of 1994 was triggered by a lot of things. It was triggered by, first, the Belgian colonization, the favoring of Tutsis, the racialization of tribes, and creating a rigid ethnic hierarchy. It was triggered by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the Hutu revolution, their rise to power in government, the Arusha Accords, and the RTLM, the radio station. It's also important to highlight that the Hutus used mainly machetes to kill. This is ironic as it reflects the time of colonization where the Hutus were farmers and they used those specific machetes for agriculture. And it was triggered by a lot of things, but in the end of the day, the big question of all of this is, can we blame it all on colonialism? The answer, in my opinion, yes, hell yeah we could. Because I don't think any of this would have possibly happened if it wasn't for colonialism, because these tribes were there. These tribes were there prior to Belgian colonialism. They were existent. You didn't see any genocide going on then, did you? And the thing is, people love to paint conflicts like this as tribalist, backwards African conflicts. But if anything, these, like for example, in the case of Rwanda, it was triggered by Belgian colonialism. The Belgians entered Rwanda, they made a huge mess, and they dipped and said, clean it up by yourselves. So in the question of, can we truly blame it all on colonialism? I still think yes, but at the same time, I think there were so many other reasons. But I think that the main thing was colonialism, and after that, all the other things came. All the other things followed. But anyway, everyone let me know what your opinion is. Do you think that we could blame, for example, this case all on colonialism? And hopefully I'll continue the series and do another country in the next episode. So thank you, and
اللهم احفظ بلادنا بلاد السودان اللهم جنبنا فيها الفتن ما ظهر منها وما بطن اللهم اجعل في بلادنا الأمن والأمان والسلم والإسلام برحمتك يا رحمن اللهم ابسط الأمن في ربوع بلادنا اللهم جنبنا كل الفتن ما ظهر منها وما بطن اللهم وحد كلمة أهل السودان على الحق اللهم وحد كلمتنا اللهم وحد كلمتنا اللهم اجمع صفنا اللهم من أرادنا وديننا وبلادنا بخير فأجر الخير على يديه ومن أرادنا بغير ذلك فاجعل الدائرة عليه اللهم بدل عسرنا يسرا اللهم بدل عسرنا يسرا اللهم بدل عسرنا يسرا وهمنا فرجا وهمنا فرجا وهمنا فرجا برحمتك يا